Hey everyone, so I hope you're still doing well in the self-isolation that everyone's going through. This is going to be our last lecture for the course to really focus on conditional process analysis. I know it sounds really complicated, but conditional process analysis is really just a combination of mediation and moderation, and you already know about this. So I'm going to go over some studies that do conditional process analysis and use it as a way to combine these two concepts for you. So just to review what mediation is where you're looking at the causal path. Let me get my laser pointer here. Where you're looking at a causal path just between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And you're thinking this third variable, the mediator, is going to explain the relationship between that independent and dependent variable. When we're thinking about a mediation analysis, of course, we have those three variables, and we focus on three different paths. We focus on path A, which is the direct effect of the independent variable on the mediator, path B, which is the direct effect of the mediator on a dependent variable, and path C prime, which is the effect of the independent variable on a dependent variable controlling for the mediator. And then we can calculate that indirect effect when we're using the Hayes method and get a bootstrap confidence interval for that indirect effect, and that's going to tell us whether this mediation is significant or not. And over here, just a summary of how we interpret that. So once again, mediation is about trying to explain this relationship by way of a third variable. So here's an example, and this will be up on Moodle, where they were looking at support for participating in a union based on your social dominance orientation, which is really the idea that you think society should be organized as a hierarchy, and it's a good thing that certain people are in power and others are not, and that people in power need to be and should be in power. So the expectation was that people who are higher in social dominance orientation would be less likely to participate in unions, because the idea is that unions are hierarchy attenuating, and the idea that they're trying to reduce the power differential between management and the workers. So someone who's high in social dominance orientation would not be in support of that because they want the management to have the most power. All right, and so what they expected, though, was that the relationship between social dominance orientation and union participation should be mediated by union identification motives. So this is how much is the union, they see the union as being part of who they are as a worker. So that should explain the relationship between social dominance orientation and union participation. And I do want to point out a lot of some of the people I talked to over the last couple of weeks mentioned this idea of, having these negative indirect effects. So this is a case where this relationship right here is expected to be negative because social dominance orientation is related to lower union identification. But on this side, union identification is expected to be positively related to union participation, right? So you're having different signs, different directions of effect overall, which makes this overall effect negative down here. All right. So here's how they described their mediation results. So they said, to assess the mediating role of union identification, the relationship between social dominance orientation and reported union participation, we performed a series of multiple regressions controlling for social demographic background and union tenure. All right, so here we go. Path A, social dominance orientation was negatively related to union participation and union identification. So that's path C, path C first, union participation and union identification. And then demonstrating a novel domain of application of social dominance orientation, we found that the more one accepted group-based domination in society, the less one participated in union activities, right? So it's the idea that if you care about that hierarchy, you're less likely to be at a union. And the less one felt identified with the union, so you don't really feel like the union is part of your identity. In line with hypothesis 2, union identification fully mediated the effect of social dominance orientation on union participation. So that's their indirect effect. When union participation was simultaneously regressed on SDO and union identification, SDO was no longer a reliable predictor, whereas union identification was positively related to participation. The Sobel test also revealed a reduction in the predictive strength of the SDO after controlling for unit identification. So this is an example where they're not using the Hayes bootstrap, they're using the that multiple step method that we talked about, and then they're using the Sobel test as a way to test the indirect effect instead of the bootstrap confidence interval. So if you remember the chapter that we read about mediation, you'll remember how Hayes talked about this Sobel test. But this is the same way, this is a different way of answering the same question. Is that indirect effect significant or not? And here they did find that unit identification was a mediator between social dominance orientation and union participation. All right, so here's a second mediation example. This is DeLima, Pearson, and Kelly. They were looking at protective behavioral strategies. So they were looking at college students and binge drinking, basically, and whether their general self-regulation strategies would be able to help them avoid alcohol-related consequences from drinking too much. But they were thinking that there might be a special relationship or special explanation for people who specifically know how to self-regulate around drinking. So that's these protective behavioral strategies. So if you've ever been to a college party where there's a lot of drinking, if someone might have coached you on here's what you do to, still be part of the group but not drink quite as much. So having an excuse ready to turn down a drink, holding on to a drink, just holding it so that no one offers you another one, not playing drinking games, and eating while you're drinking. All of these are protective behavioral strategies in order to reduce how much you drink or the negative effects of drinking so that your maybe behavior doesn't get quite as wild. All right, so this mediational diagram here is the first hypothesis they tested, which they call the self-control equals drinking control hypothesis. So their expectation is that people who are high in self-regulation more generally, they just are good at regulating their behavior and their emotions, are going to be better at using protective behavioral strategies and therefore have fewer alcohol-related consequences. Okay, so they tested this in 249 college freshmen, and you can see here are the actual numbers that they found. This diagram looks a little bit different from some of the ones that we've seen. You can see that they had alcohol consumption here, and that's just indicating that it was a control variable. All right, so here's how they explained their results. They say the self-control equals drinking control hypothesis proposed that the relationship between self-regulation and alcohol-related consequences will be mediated by PBS, or drinking control strategies. And so you can see here they're using the Hayes's bootstrap confidence intervals here. So we examine whether PBS mediated the effect of self-regulation and alcohol-related consequences while controlling alcohol consumption. So there's that control variable right there. Results revealed that both greater self-regulation and using more PBS predicted decreased alcohol-related consequences. So we can see that over here in that the strategies reduce alcohol-related consequences and self-regulation reduced alcohol-related consequences. As depicted in figure 1, self-regulation predicted PBS, so that's path A right here, which partially mediated the effect of self-regulation on alcohol-related consequences. All right, so if you look at the table over here, you can see they've got the total effect, the indirect effect via PBS. This is what we're usually used to looking at, and there's that bootstrap confidence interval, which is all below 0, so that's significant, and they also give you a p-value there. And then the direct effect, which is that relationship between the two. All right, so that's just another mediation analysis. All right, so now let's talk about moderation. So remember, the last 2 lectures have been about moderation, and moderation is where you're looking for different slopes based on group membership or different levels of a third variable. And remember, this is just the interpretation of those slopes that we have. So when when we have multiple groups or when we have different levels of our moderator variable, we can expect that slope to be different, either in strength or direction, or both. So here's DeLima, Pearson, and Kelly again. So they thought, well, maybe it's not the fact that self-regulation predicts protective behavioral strategies which predict alcohol-related consequences, so a mediational or causal path. Maybe it's the fact that people who have higher self-regulation are better at using their protective behavioral strategies. So it's a slightly different idea here. They call this the protective behavioral strategies protect the impaired hypothesis. So this is the idea that if you fail to use your protective behavioral strategies, those people who are higher in self-regulation, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my daughter screaming, playing with her dad. If you are someone who doesn't use protective behavioral strategies as well, then the fact that you have higher self-regulation is gonna kick in, is gonna protect you from the negative alcohol-related consequences. So here's the case. It's not that your self-regulation, it's not that the protective behavioral strategies are explaining why self-regulation is related to your alcohol-related strategies. It's actually that your self-regulation is making up for, compensating for the lack of protective behavioral strategies. So in this case, we're not expecting protective behavioral strategies to explain self-regulation, but instead they're working together to reduce those consequences. All right, so they use the exact same data to test moderation. So here's what they say. They say, we examine whether PBS moderated the effect of self-regulation on alcohol-related consequences while controlling for alcohol consumption. Consistent with the models above, both self-regulation and PBS were inversely related to alcohol-related problems. That's what we saw before. Further, a significant interaction revealed the effect of self-regulation was strongest among respondents who did not use PBS. So first, let's look at the table here, right? You can see they've got the slope for self-regulation, the slope for protective behavioral strategies, and then there's their interaction term right there. As you can see, that interaction term is significant, so that means that the moderation is significant. So let's take a look at how that worked. So it says, as shown in Table 6 and Figure 3, self-regulation was strongly negatively related to alcohol-related problems among individuals with relatively low use of PBS. So this is one standard deviation below the mean. More moderately related to negatively related to problems among individuals with average use of PBS, and was unrelated to alcohol-related problems among individuals with relatively high use of PBS. So here you can see they chose 3 points in which to look at protective behavioral strategies, which was their moderator here. They had one standard deviation below the mean, at the mean, and then 0.53 standard deviations above the mean. So now we're quite clear why they chose those particular numbers, but they're probably trying to stay within a good range of the data and some realistic scores here. So what you can see here is that for the people who are highest in self-regulation, they're fine. They don't have any negative consequences from their alcohol consumption, regardless of how much PBS they have. It's the people who are low in self-regulation where the PBS really is helping them. So as you can see here, as they explained, they explained using the line approach, the people who have low PBS are have fewer consequences the more self-regulation they have. So in this case, it's not that your PBS is explaining why self-regulation is helpful. This is actually saying that your self-regulation can make up for the lack of protective behavioral strategies. So that's a good example of how mediation and moderation can use the same variables and answer slightly different questions. All right, so now we can look at conditional presses. So this is again when I said moderation and mediation at the same time. And it's sometimes called moderated mediation or mediated moderation. And in the book, Hayes will talk about why he doesn't like those terms necessarily, but if you are looking at older literature, you will see those terms, moderated mediation and mediated moderation. And that is the same thing that we're talking about, conditional process analysis. All right, so here's Green and Auer, again, our union example. So what they thought, they found the significant mediation here, but they thought, well, maybe it's the case that everyone who identifies with the union may not necessarily participate in the union. It could be something about how instrumental they see the union is in bringing about changes that affects that relationship. So we examined whether the mediating effect of union identification for the STO union participation relationship is moderated by perceived union instrumentality, such that the relationship between union identification and union participation is particularly strong when the unions are perceived as enhancing workplace justice. So the unions have a really special role to play. That is, we investigated whether at the second stage of the indirect effect, union instrumentality moderates the path from union identification to union participation. When you're doing a conditional process analysis, you basically take the mediation and you can throw in a moderator on any of those paths. You can have a moderator on path A, so that would be the first stage. You can have a moderator on path B, like in this example, that would be the second stage. You can have a moderator on path C prime and say, well, it just only moderates the total, it only moderates that direct effect there. Now it still mediates, but the direct effect is what's being moderated. You could have moderation on 2 of the paths. You can have moderation on all 3 of the paths. And in fact, once you get into this book, and some of these more complicated models here, you can see these can get quite complicated. So in this one, you have 2 moderators and they are moderating all 3 paths. This is model 76. Here's model 64, where you can see moderator W is moderating A and B, and moderator Z is moderating B, right? So that way you're being selective about which paths are being moderated. And then in this one, this is what model 18, where you can see moderator W is moderating path B, but then moderator Z is moderating the path between W, moderating the moderation of W. So you can play around with it. One of the fun things about using process is that you can really choose any model that you want, whether or not it really makes sense, and just kind of see what the results are. But I'm going to discourage you from doing that, even though some people would consider that p-hacking. So, you can think about whether that would fit within your idea of what it means to do statistics. Okay, so once again, in this model, what they're doing is they're doing the mediation and the moderators on path B. Okay, so here's their table. So what you can see then here is they're looking at SDO predicting union identification. That's this equation right here. SDO predicting union participation right here. And then SDO predicting union participation with union identification is right here. And you can see that because it adds union identification as a variable. And then we've got our moderation right here. So as with mediation, you're still doing multiple regressions. So you have to have one regression with union identification as the outcome and one regression with union participation as the outcome. And so then when you're adding a moderator, all you have to do is add that interaction term on whichever outcome it is. So if we were doing path A, moderation of path A, then in our union identification regression, we would have an interaction term between social dominance orientation. So that's just how it works. It's just really where you're going to throw in the interaction term determines which path you're moderating. Okay, so here's how they described their results. So There is an overall effect of SDO on union participation. SDO and union instrumentality were related to identification. And then it says in the third equation, a moderated mediation was revealed. Okay, when they're controlling for union identification, SDO was no longer a reliable predictor, whereas union identification was still positively related. Importantly, confirming hypothesis 3b, the predicted interaction between union instrumentality and union identification was found. So there's the interaction term. 0.64 here, 0.64 here. The effect of union identification on union participation thus depended on union instrumentality. So now to say that we're focusing on the second stage, so that means path B, and they studied the indirect effects between SCO and union participation through union identification at high, intermediate, and low levels of union instrumentality to obtain accurate standard errors. So this is where they do their bootstrapping. Okay, so now to explain what's going to happen is because we have an interaction, right? We have to choose points to probe the interaction, and now we have an indirect effect at every point of that interaction, right? So we choose 3 points to probe our interaction. We're going to have 3 indirect effects. So here's where they're looking at those 3 indirect effects. The indirect effect of SEO on union participation, the mediation, was strongest at high levels of perceived union instrumentality, followed by intermediate, so there's the indirect effect, and low levels of perceived union instrumentality. So here's what, when they're saying high levels of instrumentality, right, so they're probably doing 1 standard deviation above the mean, and you can see that this effect, 0.63, is larger than when you get to the moderate levels, 0.432, and when you get to the small levels, 0.233. So this is how they're saying that mediation is strongest when people are most feel that the union is useful, and then it gets weaker the less people feel like the union is weaker. So here's how they explained it. The mediational effect of union identification for the association between SDO and union participation was strongest for members perceiving that unions affect workplace justice. Although union instrumentality did not have a direct effect on union participation, it reinforced the effect of union identification on union participation. So they're saying so that even though instrumentality itself is not really playing a role here, it's going to make this link stronger. All right, so now let's go back to Lima, Pearson, and Kelly. So here's their conditional process where their mediator now becomes a moderator of path C. So they're testing both mediation and moderation with the same variable at the same time. And this is a totally possible model here. So what we were looking at before with this one was those protective behavioral strategies, and whether it was that your protective behavioral strategies explained why your self-regulation was helpful, or if it compensated for your lack of self-regulation, or vice versa. Self-regulation compensated for your lack of PBS. So it could be both at the same time. So that's what they're testing here. So they say, consistent with previous models controlling for alcohol consumption, both self-regulation and PBS were inversely associated with alcohol-related problems. Additionally, the moderated mediated effect was significant, such that the indirect effect of self-regulation on alcohol-related problems was significant for individuals with low and average levels of self-regulation, but was not significant for individuals with good levels of self-regulation. Thus, our final results suggest a more nuanced effect. The self-control equals drinking control for the impaired. So what does this mean? I don't think they have a figure for this. Okay, so let's just think about the people who, this is self-regulation. So the people who are highest on self-regulation, like we saw with the moderation, the people who are high in self-regulation are good. They're gonna have fewer alcohol-related consequences anyway. But for the people who are lower in self-regulation, it does matter how much you use those drinking strategies. So what they're seeing is that both those protective behavioral strategies both mediate and moderate the relationship between self-regulation and alcohol-related consequences. So here's how they explain that. Is the aim of the study, as hypothesized, PBS mediated. Respondents with higher self-regulation tended to experience fewer negative consequences because they use more PBS. And their second hypothesis was that PBS would serve as a moderator, and that was the case, and they go on to explain that as well. But then this is where they explain the mediated moderation. The moderated mediation model demonstrated that the negative relationship between self-regulation and alcohol-related consequences could be explained by the use of PBS for individuals with poor to average self-regulation, but not for individuals with above average self-regulation abilities. Perhaps individuals with above average self-regulation are in less danger of engaging in unrestrained drinking with or without PBS. So once again, we see both mediation and moderation occurring because the people who are highest in self-regulation, they're fine. They don't need the protective behavioral strategies. But for the people who are lower in self-regulation, having those protective behavioral strategies is the reason, or at least can be is associated with fewer alcohol-related consequences when they're drinking more. All right, and so in your homework, you're going to be doing some practice on conditional process analysis. And then the last thing, yeah, so that's that. All right, now I'm going to stop.